I have kept the candle burning for 7 years. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not the sort of thing a man in my position would ordinarily confess. I am Aldrich Holt, steward of Valdenmere for 23 years, the Duke's closest friend since before either of us was old enough to wear a title or carry its weight. I have watched this estate through 2 generations of the Ashburn line, through floods and harvests, and the particular cruelty of English winters. I am not, by nature, a man who speaks of candles or mourning, or the kind of love that refuses to expire when all practical reason demands it should. But I have kept count. 7 years, 3 months, and some additional number of days I stopped recording because counting only made the number heavier. And in all that time, Lord Cassius Ashburn, the Duke of Valdenmere, feared throughout 3 counties, described in drawing rooms from here to London as the coldest man in England, the Duke who refused every match put before him with a politeness so thorough, it felt more final than outright contempt. That man has gone to the chapel at the eastern corner of the house every single night before he slept, and lit a candle for a woman the rest of the world believed was dead. I did not believe she was dead. I never said so to him, because belief without evidence is a thing that can destroy a man, and I had watched Cassius come close enough to destruction without any additional fuel from me. But I kept a small, private accounting of the reasons, and I folded it away where it would not leak into anything I said to him, and I waited. It is the only thing I have ever done purely on faith. She came back on a Tuesday in November. I did not know it was her when I read her letter of application. She signed it Alina Voss, Nell, she added in the second line, as though she expected to be called by the familiar name from the first day. The hand was neat, practiced, and almost entirely unlike the hand I remembered, except for the way she formed the letter V, a very slight, unnecessary flourish at the base, like the ghost of a language she had studied once and not entirely let go. I noticed it. I set the letter down. I picked it up again and held it toward the window where the November light was cleaner. I told myself I was being a sentimental fool, which is not a charge anyone in this household would ordinarily level at me, and I hired her. She was the 5th housemaid to apply that month. The house had a reputation now, not for cruelty, nothing so straightforward as that. The Duke was not a difficult employer. He was simply remote. He passed through rooms without seeming to inhabit them. He thanked the staff with perfect courtesy and appeared to see none of them. He ate what was placed before him, managed his estates with precise attention, donated quietly to the parish school and the village widows' fund, and gave every external sign of a man who had made a full and considered peace with the contours of his life. The county had largely stopped speculating about why he would not remarry, or why the East Chapel was lit every night when he had no known religious compulsion toward evening observance. They had moved on, the way counties do, toward fresher subjects. Only those of us inside the walls of Valdenmere kept our own counsel. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, a stout and sensible woman who had been with the estate for 15 years and knew when not to ask questions, which is the quality I prize most in a housekeeper, brought Nell to me on the first morning. I had prepared myself to be wrong. I had rehearsed a version of events in which this woman arrived, and was plainly no one I had ever seen before, and I would feel the mild embarrassment of a man who has let hope do his reasoning for him, and I would assign her to the linen rooms and think no more of it. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hair was darker, not dyed, but the particular darkening that comes with years indoors and with worry, and with the absence of the easy outdoor hours of a young woman in a comfortable house. It had lost the warm auburn notes I recalled. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there before. She was, I estimated, 27 or 28 years old now. She had been 20 when she vanished, though she had carried herself then with a steadiness that made her seem older, and she carried herself the same way now, a kind of deliberate composure that looked like calm and functioned, I had always suspected, as armor. She did not look at me the way a person does when they are meeting someone again after a long absence. Her eyes met mine with the flat, careful neutrality of a stranger. It was extremely well done. It was so well done, in fact, that for a moment I doubted myself entirely. And then she folded her hands, and there was the gesture, that precise, careful interlacing of fingers she had always used when she was restraining some impulse or feeling, and I knew. I said nothing. I showed her to the linen wing and introduced her to the other maids. There were 4 of them, a comfortable hierarchy with Mrs. Patton as senior housemaid, and they were kind enough women who would take their lead from her manner, which was professional and quiet. And I told Mrs. Fenwick that Miss Voss's references were in good order, which was more or less true. She had produced 2 letters that were plausible and whose signatories, if verified, would exist. I went back to my office and sat with the door closed for a considerable time. She had come back, after 7 years. She had come back as a housemaid under a name that was not hers, to a house that had spent the intervening years in a kind of stilled, principled grief she appeared not to know about. I did not yet know what she wanted. I did not know what she was afraid of. I was not entirely certain she knew I had recognized her. What I was certain of, with the absolute certainty of a man who had watched Cassius Ashburn light a candle in the East Chapel every night for 7 years without once asking him to explain himself, because it was not necessary to ask, was that if she moved through this house for any length of time at all, he would recognize her too. The question was whether that was what she had come for, and if it was, whether she was ready for what she would find. I watched her for 3 days before I understood the shape of what she was doing. She moved through Valdenmere with a painstaking, deliberate effort not to know it. This was the tell. A genuinely new housemaid navigates by confusion. She asks where things are, takes wrong turns, opens the wrong doors at the wrong times, and develops a mental map by making errors. Nell did none of this. She moved as though she had memorized a careful set of instructions the night before, and was following them with great precision, which produced a curious effect. She almost never made the ordinary housemaid's mistakes, but she made them in certain very specific locations, and always the locations where a person would not be expected to know their way unless they had lived here before and were deliberately forgetting themselves. On the first day, Mrs. Patton sent her to find extra candle stubs from the storage room off the butler's pantry, a room that is not labeled, that newcomers invariably walk past, and that requires you to know the back corridor's secondary turn. Nell found it without hesitation, then appeared to catch herself and came back by the long route, as though recalculating. Mrs. Patton remarked to me that Miss Voss was a quick learner. I agreed and said nothing more. She also knew the hot water timing. The Valdenmere pipes run in a particular pattern, old work, expensive to replace, and temperamental in the mornings. And the house has a sequence for drawing hot water from the upper rooms that a new maid must either be told explicitly or discover through 2 or 3 cold bath incidents. Nell drew hers correctly on the first morning, using the precise sequence and the specific timing, which she had not been shown, and which no one in the household had thought to explain because it did not occur to anyone that instruction might be necessary. I noticed this. I noted it privately and said nothing. She did not go to the chapel. That was the largest and most deliberate absence on the map of her movements, because the chapel stood at the end of the east corridor, and it would have been the natural shortcut through to the guest wing on that side of the house. And she took the long way every time, the route that added 4 minutes to any errand going in that direction, and which would have struck any reasonable housekeeper as inefficient, except that Mrs. Fenwick had the quality I mentioned and did not remark on it. On the second day, I watched her pass the library door and stop. She did not go in. She stood in the doorway for perhaps a count of 3, and then continued down the hall at her usual brisk, contained pace. I had been in that library when Cassius showed it to her, years ago, the summer before everything ended, when she had been a guest of Lady Miriam Ashburn, the Duke's aunt, a woman of 60 and considerable intelligence who had found her in the village school and decided she was worth knowing and worth educating, and eventually, worth bringing into the orbit of her nephew. I remembered the way the young woman had run her fingers along the spines of the books and said, very quietly, as though she were not entirely certain she was allowed to say it aloud, that she did not know a room could feel like being held. On the third day, she carried a fresh arrangement of winter greenery to the dining room and set it on the sideboard with the other household decorations, and then paused to adjust it, and I noticed she had chosen rosemary and dried lavender, which were not the typical winter arrangement for this house. Most housekeepers chose pine and dried berry clusters in November, but which were precisely the combination she had always preferred, and which Mrs. Fenwick had, without comment or explanation, continued to use for the past 7 years because the Duke, asked once by a new under-housekeeper if he had any preference for the arrangements, had said only, very briefly, rosemary, I think, and then turned back to his correspondence without elaboration. I went to find her that afternoon, after the 4 o'clock household quiet had settled. She was in the south corridor, shaking out a rug in the thin November light from the high window at the end of the passage. She looked up when I appeared, and for a moment the careful blankness on her face shifted, not dramatically, not in any way a passing observer would have caught, but enough. Enough for me to see that she had been expecting this conversation, and had perhaps been dreading it, and was also, somewhere under the dread, relieved. I said, making the motions of ordinary household passage, that Mrs. Fenwick was asking for someone in the kitchen, which was true as far as it went, and that I would walk that way myself. She set down the rug and followed me without objection. When we were clear of the other maids and in the passage between the south and west wings, the one that ran behind the kitchens and was used mainly for early deliveries and coal, which meant it was reliably empty at 4:30 in the afternoon, I stopped. I said quietly, "I know who you are." She was very still. She looked at the stone wall to my left for a moment, studying it with the concentration of a person who needs a second to arrange themselves. Then she looked at me, and the careful, practiced blankness was entirely gone. What replaced it was exhaustion, the deep, structural kind, not the tiredness of a hard week, but the tiredness of years of sustained effort at a particular kind of composure, and something I could only call a contained grief, the expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy quietly for so long that they have forgotten what it would feel like to set it down. She said, "I thought it might be you first. You always notice things you shouldn't." I asked her if she was well. It seemed the most pressing question, more pressing and more immediate than any of the others I had, and she considered it with the seriousness it deserved and said that she was, more or less, all things considered. She had been employed as a teacher for 4 years in a village 30 miles to the north, and before that had spent 3 years in service in a well-managed house in Norfolk. She was, she said, in better repair than she deserved to be, which struck me as a characteristically self-diminishing way of describing what sounded like a considerable effort at self-sufficiency. I asked her what she had come for. She looked at the floor. She said she had not entirely worked that out. She said she had heard in the village to the north where she'd been teaching that Valdenmere was hiring, and she had thought, she stopped there, restarted, she had thought she would come and see that he was well and then go. That was all. She had wanted to see with her own eyes that he was managing, that the house was managing, that things were in the broad sense right. I stood with that for a moment. I said, choosing each word, "And is he, in your assessment, having seen him this past week?" She looked up very quickly. Something moved through her face, not quite hope, but something in the same family. I said, "He is not married." Her expression shifted. She said nothing, but her hands, which had been at her sides, moved to fold in front of her in that way they always did. I said, "He has been asked, twice formally, and several times in the informal mode that is somehow more binding than the formal. He declined each time with such perfect, courteous finality that no subsequent approach was made. The county has concluded it is temperament." I have concluded it is something else entirely." She was quiet for a long time. The kitchen sounds were faint through the wall, the rhythm of Mrs. Beckett's preparations for the evening meal, a sound like the ordinary heartbeat pulse of the house going about its business. Then she said, in a voice that had gone somewhat unsteady at the edges, the way a voice does when someone is not crying but is holding the possibility of it with some concentration, "I did not come to disturb anything. I only wanted to know he was all right. That the estate was right, that he had." I said, "Myra." She closed her eyes briefly when I used her name, the real one. I said, "He is not all right. He is managed, and he is functional, and he is in many respects admirable, and he lights a candle in the East Chapel every single night before he sleeps and has not stopped once, not in 7 years." She turned away from me. She put one hand flat against the wall, palm pressed to the stone, and I had the sense she needed it to stay upright, and I did not speak for a little while, to give her the space to find her footing again. When she turned back, her composure was reassembled, a fraction less perfect than before, some structural element showing through where it had previously been concealed, but holding. She said he should have stopped. That was the hole I left so that he could move forward, so he would not feel bound. He had reasons to go on, good and sufficient reasons, a marriage, heirs, the estate's future, his own. I said, "I'm aware that was the intention. I am less certain it was the result." She shook her head. She said, "He will be angry. When he finds out who I am, he will be, I don't know that I could bear his anger. He had every reason to do exactly what I wanted him to do. He had a perfectly clear path forward, and I said, "He is not angry. Not now. In the early years perhaps, but that is not what this is now." She said, "What is it?" I said, "That is the conversation you need to have with him. I am not the right person for that particular transmission." She said, "He will look at me and see someone who left him. That is what I am. That is what I will be to him. And the woman he has been keeping the candle for, that woman was 20 years old, and she had not yet." I said, "Myra, listen to me. You are going to have to tell him, or he will find out himself, which will happen sooner than you think. He already looks at you with something he cannot account for. It is only a matter of days, possibly less. And the manner in which he discovers it, whether it is something you give him or something he simply arrives at, will matter very much to what comes after." She looked at me for a long time. I could see the thing she was most afraid of, the clearest and most specific fear underneath all the others. Not his anger, and not the shock of reunion, but this: that the candle had been lit for a memory, for the 20-year-old woman who had left, and that the 30-year-old woman who had come back was different enough, changed enough by years and hardship, and the particular reshaping that 7 years of honest labor does to a person, that she would not fit the shape of what he had kept. I said, "Come to the East Chapel on Thursday evening. He will be there at 10. He is always there at 10. The door will be unlocked." She said, "Aldrich." I said, "It does not have to be a confrontation. It does not have to be a scene. It only has to be the truth, and you in the same room with him when you say it." She was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen sounds continued through the wall. Then she said very quietly, "I'll think about it." I said, "Think quickly." She went back to the corridor. I went back to my office and sat with my hands folded on the desk and felt the particular, exhausting sensation of a man who has been carrying vigil for 7 years and can now see the outcome clearly but cannot hurry the last steps of it. He noticed her that evening at supper. I know this because I was in the dining room when he came down, attending to some papers at the writing table in the corner. It was ordinary for me to work there in the evenings when the household was quiet, and I watched his gaze move to the sideboard, to the greenery arrangement, with the small, arrested quality of a man who has encountered something unexpected in familiar surroundings. He looked at it the way you look at a word you have read 10,000 times and have suddenly found startling in its shape, as though the shape of it were new and had always been there, and you had somehow failed to see it until now. He sat down and ate his supper. He said nothing. But he looked at the rosemary arrangement twice more during the meal, and both times with that same arrested quality. And I sat in the corner and kept my eyes on my papers and felt 7 years of patience winding toward its end. The following morning she was in the library. I had not told her to go there. I did not know if it meant the decision had been made, or whether the library had simply been pulling at her since the first day and she had finally given up resisting. She was dusting, or making the motions of dusting, which is a task that can be performed while one stands with a hand on the spine of a book and stares at nothing, which was what she was doing when the Duke walked in. I was not in the room. I was in the adjacent corridor, attending to the window latch that had been reported stiff, and the door stood partly open and I stopped. I am not generally a man who listens at doors. I made an exception. He said, "I beg your pardon. I didn't know anyone was still in here." She said, "I'll finish quickly, Your Grace. I apologize for being in your way." A pause. Then he said, and I heard in his voice the quality I had been hearing for 7 years, the particular careful steadiness of a man speaking with deliberate control because the alternative is to stop speaking entirely. "No, please. There is no hurry at all. It is a pleasant thing to see the room in use. I have been finding the house somewhat empty of late." She said, and I could hear her trying with precision and effort to sound like a housemaid, and largely succeeding except for the particular, unself-conscious intelligence in the architecture of how she framed her words, which is not a quality you can manufacture or disguise entirely. "I can come back later, truly, if you would prefer the quiet." He said, "I find lately that I would not prefer the quiet at all." A pause in which I heard nothing, which meant she said nothing, which meant she was standing with her hands still, the way she stood when she was being careful. He said, "Have you been with us long? I don't believe we've spoken before." She said, "Not long, a few weeks." He said, "And where were you before Valdenmere?" She said, after a hesitation so small most ears would not have registered it, "Yorkshire. I held a teaching post there for some years." He said, "You were a teacher. What subjects?" She said, "Reading primarily. Some arithmetic, enough geography to be useful, not so much as to be alarming." He was quiet for a moment. Then, and I recognized this in him, the quality of a man who is about to say something he has already decided is eccentric but cannot prevent, he said, "Forgive me. This will seem a peculiar thing to say to a new member of the household, and I assure you there is nothing improper in the intention. There is something about you that I cannot account for, a familiarity I can't place. It is probably nothing more than a trick of light. I apologize for mentioning it." She said, "Please don't apologize, Your Grace. It is not unusual, I think. Faces can resemble other faces one has known." He said, "Yes, I expect that is it." He remained in the library another quarter hour. I heard him settle into the chair by the east window, his particular chair, the one with the faded armrests and the sound of pages turning. She moved around the room with her cloths quietly, not speaking again. And then she left and he stayed, and I moved away from the door and found that my hands, on the window latch I had been pretending to examine, were entirely steady, and that this surprised me somewhat. That evening at supper, he was quiet in a way that was slightly different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet at dinner was the quiet of a man occupied internally with estate matters or correspondence, the particular, solitary thinking he did between 4 o'clock and sleep. This was a different quality, less settled, more turned outward, the quality of a man who has been given something to consider that he has not yet filed into any of his existing categories. He looked at the rosemary arrangement on the sideboard for a moment longer than he had the previous evening. When he spoke, he asked me about the Northfield drainage, a legitimate and pressing matter concerning a retaining wall that needed attention before the frost hardened the ground, and we discussed it efficiently, and he retired at his ordinary hour. But I sat in the dining room after he had gone and looked at the rosemary in its winter arrangement and thought, 2 more days. The day between the library morning and the chapel night was in some ways the most difficult to sit through. Nothing particular happened. He passed her twice in the course of ordinary household movement, and both times paused, not conspicuously, not rudely, simply for a fraction longer than the pass and continue of a duke and a housemaid would ordinarily require. And both times she kept her eyes correctly averted and her pace correct, and nothing in the exchange could have been identified by any observer as out of the ordinary. But I was not any observer. I knew that his pauses were lengthening, and that his composure at supper was costing him more than it had cost him the night before. It was the melody that undid the last of his composure, the evening before Thursday. She did not know he was in the East Corridor. I am reasonably certain of this, because she had been so careful and so controlled for the entire preceding fortnight that only a genuine moment of inattention would have permitted it. She was carrying a stack of folded linens from the upper closets toward the guest rooms in the north wing, a route that took her past the entrance to the long gallery, and she was humming something under her breath. Something low and very quiet and entirely unself-conscious, the kind of tune a person hums when they are completely certain they are alone, when the walls are their only company, and the sound is not for any ear but their own. The Duke had come down early from his study. He was standing at the far end of the gallery, not doing anything in particular, simply standing, which was itself unusual. He moved through rooms with purpose and did not generally stand still in them without a book or a paper or some other legitimate occupation. He was looking out at the frost-covered south lawns, and he heard it. I was in the gallery myself, some distance behind him. I had been there legitimately. There is a writing table where I sometimes sit in the evenings, and I had come to collect a ledger I had left. I will not pretend I had not been keeping a particular watch on the Duke's movements that week. I had been. When I came in, he was already standing at the far window, and I had come in quietly, and I stayed quiet, because something in the set of his shoulders stopped me. She had passed by the gallery entrance and was gone before he could turn entirely around. Her footsteps went on down the corridor, steady and brisk, and the melody stopped with them, stopped so cleanly that I knew she had heard something, or felt something, and brought herself up sharp. He stood for a long time, looking at the end of the corridor where she had passed. He did not move. He did not speak. I did not speak either, and after a while he turned and walked back through the gallery without having done or said anything, with the expression of a man who has just been given a piece of information his mind is not yet ready to process. He came to me before dinner. He did not sit. He stood across from my desk, which was the ordinary arrangement when we spoke, and he said, "I need to ask you something." He said it calmly, with the specific quality of calm that is constructed very deliberately and brick by brick and held together by will. I said, "Ask it then." He said, "The housemaid, Miss Voss." I set down my pen. He said, "I want you to tell me about her references. Who provided them?" I said, "Her references are in order." He said, "That is not what I asked you." I looked at him. He looked at me. We have known each other 30 years, and in 30 years I have not been able to conceal much from him that he was specifically looking for, and I knew, in this particular silence, that I was not concealing anything now. I said, "What is it you are asking exactly?" He said, "I am asking whether she is who she says she is." The silence that followed that question was not comfortable. It was the silence of a man asking, very precisely, for the truth, and of another man deciding how much of the truth to give him and in what form. I held it for 7 or 8 seconds. Then I said, "Come to the East Chapel tomorrow night, 10 o'clock. He looked at me for a very long time. I know his face well. I have described it as controlled, and it was, in its external presentation. But I know what this face looks like from the inside out. I know the difference between the Duke's public composure, which is architectural, and the Duke's private composure, which is somewhat more fragile and considerably more costly. What I saw in that moment was a man standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. A man who had been standing at that edge, some days more consciously than others, for 7 years, and who understood that the moment of resolution was at hand, but could not yet see whether it would be the resolution he had been keeping the candle for or whether it would be the other kind. He said, "Aldrich." I said, "10 o'clock, please go." He left. I sat for a while with the evening settling into the house around me, the particular quiet of a November evening at Valdenmere, the fires banked, the wind off the vale finding the old joints of the building, the distant sound of the kitchen settling into the hours before sleep, and I thought that I had never been so tired of waiting for anything in my life, and that tomorrow it would be over, and that I did not know what over would look like. I found her after the household supper in the servants' hall. She was sitting at the end of the long table apart from the other maids, who were comfortable enough in their own conversation. Mrs. Patton was telling a story about a previous posting, and the others were attentive, and she had a cup of tea and the look of a woman thinking very hard about something that was not in the room. I sat across from her and said, quietly enough to be below the others, "He knows something. I have asked him to come to the chapel tomorrow night at 10. He will be there. You must be there before him." She looked at her cup. She said, "You told him." I said, "I told him to come. I told him nothing of substance. What he does with what he finds there is between the two of you, and has been since well before I became any part of it." She wrapped both hands around the cup. The steam curled in the lamplight. She said, "I'm afraid." I said, "I know." She said, "Not of his anger. I keep saying that because it seems like the natural thing to be afraid of, given how I left, but it is not the anger." I said, "I know that too." She said, "What if I am the wrong person? What if the woman he has been, what if what he has kept for 7 years has a shape that I no longer fit? I have changed. I am not 20 years old. I have had 7 years of a life that was not this life, and I am different in ways I cannot entirely account for. And what if he looks at me and what he sees is not enough, is less than what he was keeping?" I looked at her across the table. She was staring at her cup, not at me, and in the lamplight she looked very young and very tired at once, which was, I thought, exactly what she was. I said, "Let me tell you something about the Duke. He is a man of, as you know, limited and very deep commitments. He does not give his attention lightly. He does not give his loyalty lightly. He has never, in 30 years of my knowing him, simply decided that a thing he cared about was over and put it away. He does not work that way." She said, "That is what worries me. He had every." I said, "What he should have done and what he did are now both fixed. We cannot alter either. What is not fixed is what happens tomorrow night. That is still entirely open." She looked up then. I said, "You came back. That is not a small thing. You could have stayed in Yorkshire. You could have stayed in Norfolk. You could have gone to Edinburgh or Bristol or any other city of sufficient size to make a former life invisible. You did not. You came back to this house, under a name that was not yours, and you arranged rosemary on his sideboard, and you stood in the doorway of his library, and you came back. That is the most important thing that has happened at Valdenmere in 7 years, and you are the only person in this household who does not know it yet." She was very still. I said, "The garden door on the east side will be unlocked at 9:30. Come in through the garden. Be at the chapel before 10. She said after a long pause, "All right." I said good night and went back to my office and sat for a while in the dark, which I do not generally do, and thought about a summer afternoon nearly a decade ago when a young woman had stood in the doorway of the library and said she did not know a room could feel like being held, and about how the Duke had looked at her from across the room with the expression of a man who has found something he was not expecting to find, and is not yet certain he is allowed to keep it. I rose early Thursday and managed the household's mourning with the ordinary discipline I have maintained for 23 years. I confirmed that the garden door latch had been cleared. I arranged, without drawing attention to it, that there would be no occasion for any other member of the household to require anything in the east wing between 9 and 11 in the evening. I set my ledger straight. I went about the day. He came down at 8 in the morning and went through the day with his usual precision, a state correspondence in the morning, a ride in the early afternoon, papers again before supper. He said nothing to me beyond ordinary household business. But twice I saw him pause in the middle of tasks and stand still for a moment with an internal quality about his expression, the quality of a man running through something in his mind, rehearsing some version of words or events, and then returning to the work at hand with a care that suggested the rehearsal was not yet complete. At 9:30 I was in the corridor adjacent to the east wing. I heard the garden door, a careful sound, the latch, the careful push, the soft close of it, and then light footsteps on the stone flags of the east passage. She had come in through the garden as I asked. At 10:02, I heard the Duke's footsteps from the main corridor. His stride is distinctive to me, the particular deliberate quality of it, the way a man walks when he has learned that his size and presence can be unexpected in narrow spaces. I heard him come around the turn into the east passage and stop at the chapel door. I did not hear the door open. What I heard was the cessation of movement, complete, total, the way motion stops when someone has seen something that requires all available attention and leaves none for anything else. I stood in the corridor and I did not move. He told me, later, that he had come in to find her standing beside the altar with her hands folded in front of her. The candle he had lit the previous night was still on the altar. He had not yet extinguished it, and she had not touched it, and it was burning steadily in the still air of the chapel. She had taken off her housemaid's apron before coming. She was wearing her own plain dress, dark and neat and nothing remarkable, but it was hers, not the household's, and he noticed. He stood in the doorway. She heard him and she turned. He told me he had known before she turned. He had known in some wordless, anterior part of himself since the rosemary arrangement, since the hesitation outside the library door, since the melody in the east corridor. And he had been refusing, with the discipline of 7 years of practice, to let that knowledge become something he acted on, because the cost of being wrong was larger than he could afford. But when she turned, when the candlelight reached her face in full, the older face, the thinner face, with its fine lines and its careful, exhausted composure, the knowledge moved from the wordless part of him into something concrete and complete, like a key finding a lock it was made for. He said her name, her real name. She said Cassius. He stood in the doorway for a long time. She told me later that she had been afraid, standing there, that what she would see in his face was something too large and too raw for her to receive, that 7 years of a private, disciplined grief would break the surface all at once in a way that neither of them would be able to manage. But what she saw was not that. What she saw was stillness, a kind of held stillness, the way a person looks when they have been carrying something for a very long time and have just been told they may put it down. He said, "Where did you go?" She told him. She told him all of it, the years in Norfolk, the cold first winter of service in a household where she was new and unknown and had no one, the gradual reconstruction of a life, the village school in Yorkshire and the 4 years of teaching, the children who were not entirely unlike the children she had grown up among and who were, she found, easier to love than almost anything else she had encountered in the intervening years. She told him about the night she left, the things his uncle had said, and the things his cousin had threatened, and the calculation she had made at 20 years old that she was not certain she would make the same way now. She told him she had believed for years that he had moved on, that she had told herself it was the most likely outcome, that there had been a period in the 2nd and 3rd years when she had been almost certain of it, when the thought had been like a bruise she kept pressing to see if it had healed yet. He listened. He moved from the doorway into the room partway through, not toward her but to the nearer pew, and he sat, and he watched her with a quality of attention she described to me as the most concentrated silence she had ever sat inside. Not cold, not closed, but focused, the way a lens focuses light. When she finished, there was a silence. He said, "You left so that I could have an uncomplicated future." She said, "Yes, that was what I intended." He said, "And did it occur to you to consult me on whether that was what I wanted?" She said very quietly, "I thought I knew what you needed. Better than you did at 20. I was arrogant about it, I think, looking back. I thought I was being selfless, and I think I may simply have been afraid, and told myself it was selfless so that it would be bearable." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I'm not angry." She looked up. He said, "I was angry, for approximately the first 2 years in intervals. After that it became something else, something heavier and more permanent and harder to name. I have spent a considerable amount of time in this room working out what to call it, and I have never reached a satisfactory conclusion except that I could not stop coming here, and I could not stop the candle." She said, "Cassius." He said, "Let me finish. I have been composing versions of this for some time, and I would prefer to get through at least the substance of it before I lose the thread." She said nothing. She told me afterward that she had almost smiled at that, the specific, familiar quality of his precision, even in the middle of something enormous. He said, "I did not marry. I want to be clear that this was not, that I was not unaware of the expectation, or the practical necessity in some respects, or the eventual cost to the line. I understood all of it. I understood it very well. I simply could not perform a feeling I did not have for any of the women who were presented to me, and I was not willing to do that to another person simply because it would have been convenient." He stopped. He said, "What I felt," he paused again, which was unusual. He is generally exact in language. "What I felt was not something I could put aside because it was inconvenient. It did not behave like something that could be put aside. I tried in the early years to find out whether it could. I found that it could not." She said, "You should have let it. I wanted you to let it." He said, "I know you did." She said, "I came back because I couldn't. I told myself I only wanted to see that you were well. I told myself that was the whole of it. I know now that it wasn't." He said, "Why did you come back as Nell Voss?" She said, "Because I didn't know if you had, because I was afraid. Because I thought if I came as myself you would feel obligated to something, and I didn't want obligation. I wanted," she stopped. She said, "I wanted to see the house as it was and see you as you were without the weight of the past on everything. And then when I saw that you were, when I heard about the candle, I didn't know what to do with that." He stood. He crossed the chapel to her, 4 or 5 steps in the small room, close enough that the candlelight reached both of them, and he said, "Look at me." She did. He said, "I have been lighting a candle in this room every night for 7 years. I would like you to understand that I knew, when I did it, that it was probably irrational. That I knew it was not something a sensible man would continue indefinitely without any evidence that it was warranted. I did it anyway. I continued to do it because there was something in me that was not satisfied with the alternative, and I had learned, over the years, to take that seriously." She said, "I heard about it from Aldrich." He said, "Then you understand what I am telling you without my having to say it more plainly." She said, "I understand the candle. I am not certain I understand what you want now." He said, "I want you to stop being Nell Voss." She said, "I know." He said, "I want you to remain at Valdenmere, not as a housemaid, not under a name that isn't yours. I want—" He stopped and looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she described as somewhere between absolute certainty and absolute vulnerability, the expression of a man who has made up his mind completely and is about to discover whether the universe agrees with him. He said, "I want what I have always wanted. Since the summer you told me this library felt like being held. I have not wanted anything else in 7 years. I am done pretending that I will eventually want something else. She said, Cassius, I have changed. He said, I know. She said, I am not the same person who. He said, I know. Neither am I. He looked at her steadily. He said, you came back. That is the only thing I needed to know. Whatever kind of person you have become in 7 years, she is the kind of person who came back, and that is enough. That is more than enough. It is, in fact, more than I have any right to. She said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, I'm afraid I won't fit what you've been keeping. He said, you are more. I told you at 20 that you were more than you believed, and I have revised that assessment upward every year since, based on evidence. You came back. You arranged the rosemary on my sideboard. You stood in the doorway of my library. You hummed the melody I have been hearing in my head for 7 years in the corridor outside the long gallery, and I heard it, and I am standing in this room. You fit everything I have been keeping. You are the reason I have been keeping it. She looked at him for a long time. The candle burned steadily between them. Outside the chapel windows, the November garden was dark and frost-white, and the vale beyond it was darker still, and the house around them was settled into its late evening quiet, the fires banked and the corridors empty. She said, I am so sorry for how I did it, for how long it has been. He said, we have a great deal of time now. She said, yes. He said, will you stay? She said, yes. He put out his hand, and she took it, and for a moment they simply stood in the chapel with the candle between them and the 7 years of it passing through them both, becoming something they could carry together instead of separately, the weight rearranged, the space between them closed. I stood in the corridor and listened to the silence that followed, which was the warm, complete silence of a room that has finally stopped holding its breath, and I thought, there it is. There is the thing I have been keeping faith for, and I felt, for the first time in 7 years, the particular satisfaction of a man who has been proved right about the most important thing. After a time I went back to my office. I poured a small glass of brandy, which I do not generally do late at night, and I sat in the firelight and let the weak sustained, exhausted alertness settle away from me like a coat coming off. In the morning the Duke came to my office before breakfast. He looked different, not dramatically, not in any way a stranger would name. But I have known this face for 30 years, and I know the difference between a man who is maintaining himself and a man who no longer needs to. He said, I will need to speak to Mrs. Fenwick about adjustments to the household arrangements. I said, I thought you might. He said, I would like Miss Voss. He stopped. He said, I would like Myra to be made comfortable in the house in a capacity suited to what she will be here, not as a servant. He paused again with the slight self-consciousness of a man reaching for the right word in an unusual situation. He said, as my intended. I said, I will speak to Mrs. Fenwick this morning. He said, Aldrich. I said, Your Grace. He said, thank you for all of it. I said it was a small thing. He said, no, it was not. He was right. It was not small. It was 7 years of a candle and a rosemary arrangement, and a faint flourish at the base of a V on a letter of application, and the particular, obstinate faith of a man who understood that some things do not go out simply because they are no longer visible, and the patience to tend them until the morning the reason for them came back through the door. The county was surprised by the engagement. Of course it was. A duke who had refused every match for 7 years, who had the county's daughters beginning to accept that Valdenmere would pass eventually to a collateral line, and who had now announced his intention to marry a woman no one had heard of, a woman who had, until very recently, been engaged as a housemaid on the estate's own staff. There was a season of speculation. Several families were briefly affronted. A solicitor wrote, on behalf of one of the declined families, a letter that was couched in the language of friendly concern, but amounted to a question about the Duke's judgment. The Duke replied with the particular courtesy that leaves no opening for continuation, and that was the end of that. But he was so plainly, so visibly at ease with himself for the first time in the memory of anyone who had observed him over the past years, that the affront could not sustain itself against the evidence. There is a quality that a man carries when he has made his peace, not the managed, disciplined peace of someone who has accepted an absence, but the genuine peace of a man who has found what he was looking for, and it communicates itself. It communicated itself in the way he spoke to the estate tenants on his quarterly rounds, with a warmth that several of them remarked on to me directly, saying they did not know what had happened to his grace, but that he seemed like a different man. In the way he managed the correspondence that had previously occupied him with a slightly grim efficiency, and now occupied him with something closer to interest. In the way he walked through Valdenmere, no longer passing through the rooms as though they were corridors to somewhere else, but inhabiting them, stopping in them, occasionally bringing something he was reading to a window for the better light, and staying there with it in a way that suggested the room was comfortable to him. Valdenmere, which had for 7 years had a particular gray quality to its atmosphere, the atmosphere of a house very well managed but not entirely inhabited, began, by imperceptible degrees, to feel like itself. She moved into the rooms that had been Lady Miriam's, the Duke's aunt, who had brought her to Valdenmere the first time, and who was now in Bath but wrote, when she heard the news, a letter of such uncomplicated joy that Mrs. Fenwick read it twice before bringing it to the Duke and wept a little at her desk, which she would have been displeased to know I saw. She learned Valdenmere again, not with the careful, deliberate effort of Nell Voss trying not to know it, but directly, openly, as someone who was being asked to inhabit it fully. She walked through the rooms she had been avoiding. She went to the library without hesitation and stood for a long time with one hand on the books, and the Duke came in and found her there and said nothing for a while, and then said, "Still the same," and she said yes, and they stood side by side in the library that felt like being held, and I believe, though I was not there, that they were both briefly, quietly 20 years old again, and then both of them entirely themselves, and that this was the better thing. The wedding was quiet. He had wanted a small ceremony, and she had agreed with a relief he said was entirely transparent, and that he found extremely endearing. They were married in the East Chapel, which had, after all, been the site of the most significant events in the private history of Valdenmere for some years, and which seemed, under the circumstances, the only right room for it. She wore the family's creamwork lace, Lady Miriam's, passed down, worth considerably more than its weight in sentiment. She wore it over a pale gold gown that Mrs. Fenwick had arranged with the discreet, efficient joy of a woman who has been waiting for an occasion for 7 years, and intends to do it properly. I stood at the back of the chapel and watched him take her hand. He held it with the grip of a man who has lost something, found it, and arranged things thoroughly so that losing it again will not be required. He looked at her with the expression I first saw at a dinner nearly a decade ago, the expression of a man who has found what he was looking for, who has found it again, and who has now bound the finding in something permanent enough to be trusted. She looked at him the way a woman looks when she has made a long journey and has arrived at last, exactly where she was going. The candle on the altar burned as it had burned every night for 7 years. He had not extinguished it. He told me later that he did not intend to extinguish it, that he had lit it first in mourning, and that it had become, over the years, something else, and was now simply part of the character of this room and of this house, and that he saw no reason to put out a light that had, against all reasonable expectation, been answered. Some lights, I have found, are not lit merely to mark an absence. They are lit in the belief that what is gone will eventually find its way home, and kept because the cost of keeping them is nothing compared to the cost of going dark too soon. Valdenmere had waited a long time. It had kept itself in good order, the fires banked, the corridors swept, the garden maintained against the season, the rooms full of rosemary, in the manner of a house that expects, eventually, to be entirely inhabited by all the people it was built for. She is in the library now as I write this. I can hear them from the corridor, their voices, low and unhurried, the particular quiet conversation of two people who have found they have a great deal to say to each other and are in no rush to say it, because they have the time now, the time they should always have had. The Duke's voice, and hers Myra's, her real name, spoken aloud in this house again, by him and by me and by Mrs. Fenwick, who took the news with a practical efficiency that I recognized as covering considerable feeling. The candle in the East Chapel will burn tonight. It has burned every night for 7 years, and it will burn tonight in a different spirit entirely. Not as vigil, not as mourning, not as the solitary ceremony of a man keeping faith in an empty room, but as the ordinary warmth of a house with its fires lit and its people in it. It is a small thing, a candle. It is also, I find, everything. I am Aldrich Holt, steward of Valdenmere for 23 years, and I have kept faith for 7 of them, and I was right to do so, and that is the whole of what I have wanted all along to say.